Good to see everybody this morning. Glad everybody's here. Let's be turning our Bibles to the 13th chapter of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 13. We just breached the boundary into chapter 13 last week, so we'll be in chapter 13 of Hebrews today. And I proudly said last week we'll be looking at verses 7 through 17, and then when I got to studying this week, I had so much fun in the first 6 verses, I thought we won't make it probably past verse 6 today, so there's just a whole lot there. So we'll be in the first 6 verses. There are notes on the table for chapter 13 if you don't have those and you want to follow along. We're still in the first question, and we'll stay in the first question until next week when we start dealing with leadership. So we will for sure... will actually be the week after. Bethel has their summer series this month, and theirs is a Sunday/Monday night, and I'll be there next week doing one of the 4 slots for their summer series, and so it'll be the week after that we come back, and then I'll do verses 7 through 17. But it's an interesting look at leadership. There's some principles of leadership there, especially verse 17. But also some principles that are drawn from the Lord Himself, and we'll take a look at that. There's a lot to think about in these verses, and one of the questions is, do you think verse 7 and verse 17 are the same groups of people? Because he mentions verse 7, those who rule over you, and verse 17, those who rule over you, and are they the same? And if not, who are they? So we'll talk about what that might be the week after next. All right, so let's look at verses 1 through 6 again. Last week we did cover verse 1, let brotherly love continue, and we even ended right at the buzzer by talking about some of the very practical ways we try to help brotherly love continue. We facilitate brotherly love. So let's pick back up now in verse 2. We'll cover verses 2 through 6. Very, very good practical advice. So verse 2. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Let's look at the first part of that, and then we'll discuss the second part of that, which is the controversial part. There's a lot of theories about what that might mean. I think the context of Hebrews helps us out. So I think we've already had some indication for that. But let's take a look at verse 2. All right, so verse 2 he says, don't be forgetful to entertain strangers. What's the principle here? What's he encouraging us to do? What is it? Be hospitable. What was it? Love one another. There's a practical demonstration of love that should be shown in our care for each other. Art? Yeah, there's a reaching out that is a part of that under the general heading of hospitality, and all that's true. It's love that prompts us. It's practically we reach out to one another. We're connected to one another. So this is essentially something about hospitality. So he says, don't forget to entertain strangers. Now, when he says entertain, does he mean here you're inviting members of the church over so that they can watch Netflix with you? What's entertain carry the sense of? Yeah, fellowship. And if somebody, for example, was traveling in the first century, entertain would mean what? You host them, right? You're accommodating whatever needs they have. And interestingly, there are still some people who practice it today, but I don't know that especially American culture, we aren't exactly a hospitable culture in some respects. But in the ancient Near East, if you were to put yourself back in the first century, was hospitality sort of a staple of the culture back then? It was very much practiced in the first century. So even within, for example, a Jewish community, it was almost expected as part of the culture that you would do that. And it was a bonding experience between the guest and the host. And so obviously, it's now enjoined as a Christian responsibility, and for other Christians it's a display, like Art said, of brotherly love. And there was probably, from a travel standpoint, not just a spiritual compulsion to do it, But there was a real practical need to do that, because let's say that you are traveling. I'm traveling in the first century. What are the conditions of travel like in the first century? Not just traveling, but also the place where I would potentially stay. What is it?
No hotels.
Okay. There, it's not like you can check into a Holiday Inn Express. There were inns that you could stay in, but what were the conditions like at the inns back then? Yeah, not a ton of space. They're crowded. They were expensive. Often they were morally reprehensible places, because not only were they inns, sometimes they were just brothels, and that was the choice, to stay in a place in a brothel. So for a Christian, travel was, and the road of travel was generally not safe. We have parables of Jesus that even talk about the unsafe condition of roads. And so there was a lot of reason for Christians to be the support system of those who were traveling, especially if you were traveling as an evangelist. You're traveling, you're trying to spread the gospel. There's a need for your expenses to be somewhat offset. And so the idea is, consider the conditions and consider the needs of the saints, and then be hospitable accordingly. And it's interesting, the language here is something to the force of stop neglecting hospitality, which may go along with what we talked about last week, which when brotherly love is retracted, when it's withdrawn in hard circumstances, they may not have been as apt to show hospitality. And the writer's now saying, be sure that hospitality is extended as well. And we're told about this in several places. I jotted down some. One I jotted down was Matthew 25, verse 31. And this is when Jesus is talking about the judgment scene. And remember, at the judgment scene, he's talking about things that have been left undone. And you have people who are hungry and they're naked. And the condition, at least there, for entering heaven is, did you feed me? Did you clothe me? And there's the hospitality that's talked about in that passage. It should be for us a goal of Christianity that we would be hospitable. And it doesn't mean that every single Sunday and every day of the week you always have to take people into your home, because not everybody can do that. But the desire to do it and the ways in which we do it, even like Art said, you're just reaching out to somebody, right? That's being hospitable. But it's part of Christianity. Let's take a look at a couple of passages. Look with me at Romans chapter 12. Go with me to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. And I think this verse essentially summarizes Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Look at verse 13. Distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. And those two things go together. So the need could be a place to stay. The need could be a meal. The need could be help with bills. The need could be any of those things. Whatever the need is when it's within the church, the idea is that we try to help one another. Now, add to this 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9, and the writer Peter says, use hospitality without grumbling. So there's not only the display of it, but there's an attitude that goes behind it. And the attitude is that you do it joyfully. Don't complain about it if you have to do it. Gloria, I saw your hand.
I was going to say, in my Bible, in verse 13, where it says, given the hospitality,
Yeah.
has a note in the center section that says, pursue it.
Pursuing it. Yeah, it's an active thing. So this would be something, for example, like if the elders get up and they make an announcement, and they were to say, hey, we've got a family that's been displaced. They're members of the church, because that would fit the context. He said they're members of the church and they need a place to stay. Would anybody be willing to do that? And in a congregation of 200 people, you just hear silence and crickets chirping. That would not be fitting. I get that your house may not be the cleanest it's been in 3 weeks, and you've let a few pieces of laundry hanging out. But the idea is, whatever it is, I'm gonna relieve the needs of the saints, and I'm gonna do that. And there ought to be, well, hey, they can stay at my house. No, they can stay at my house. Or I'm gonna take them out to eat. I'll take them out to eat. But the idea is that we're all trying to pursue hospitality, because that's just part of Christianity.
But I sometimes wonder if we don't
Yeah. I think it's personal. And that's the only way really it can be fulfilled from a, I mean, obviously a congregation like the elders could, for example, say, we're going to take some money and help offset some needs, but there's a practical side that can kind of only be fulfilled personally. I saw a couple of hands go up. Yeah, Bob, go ahead, brother. Yes, sir. I think that's exactly fitting. Yeah. And that's what Joel's talking about. There's a personal aspect to it that I think we have to be willing to do. And I know that the response would be, it's a little inconvenient for me personally, but that's the challenge, isn't it? Because hospitality demands for us to set aside the inconvenience and do what's right for our brethren. And I think that's what's being called for here. Now, are there things that limit the ability of people to be hospitable sometimes? What would be some limitations on that? Okay, so if you don't have good health, you're probably in need of being shown hospitality, right? Like Art was saying, you're the person that needs to be reached out to and looked in on, and you may not be able to do as much as another. What would be another limitation that would sort of hinder our ability to be hospitable? Oh, yeah. 2 John 2 through 9. You don't do that. You don't extend it to those people. Gene, I think I heard you. Financial. Okay, so is it, could everybody host in their home if they weren't financially able to do it? I mean, it's expensive sometimes to provide for folks. And I saw, was it Terry? And then over here. Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah. 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 I think we have to remember it's that the benevolent activity of the church is not just simply for Christians. It extends beyond that. And for non-Christians, showing hospitality and being benevolent, what kind of influence is that? What does that fall in the category of? That's evangelism. Because according to the book of Acts, when evangelism is done, it's not just what you do in word. The benevolent activity can open up the door to speak the word. And there's plenty of examples of that in the book of Acts. So we should be willing to do it to both. I saw another, Tom, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, timing and restraints on time. And yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's tough. And so, and what happens is if somebody's limited, well, not everybody's limited in the same way, then somebody else jumps in and takes over where one can't do it, and then we get the issue covered. It is so important to God that we be hospitable that in the qualifications for elders, do you remember what it stated of that an elder would be? Given to hospitality. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, Titus chapter 1, verse 8. So it is a quality, it's an action that all of us, like Gloria pointed out, that we should pursue. We should actively pursue being hospitable in every single way that hospitality works out. Now, there's a blessing involved in it, because if you go back to verse 2, here's the controversial part of this. He said, for by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. And that's widely debated as to the meaning of that. In my judgment, I don't think it's a hard statement, because I think in the book he's kind of explained it. What does that mean? Does he mean that when you say you got a Christian family visiting, like say this Sunday a Christian family comes in and they're like, we've been traveling and we've had some bad things happen, and you invite them into your home for a meal, and they say, yeah, we're from Kentucky and we're heading back to Kentucky and we appreciate this so much, you've helped us out, and as you're looking out the driveway, they just disappear, and you go, oh, those are angels in my house today. Is that what he's talking about here? No. What is he saying?
Well, going back to that, and I'm not saying it's what it's saying at all. I wondered, did Lot know those were angels?
That's it. Okay.
He knew when they departed who they were.
Yes.
When he invited them in, they were just strangers. And he said, come to our house.
Yeah.
Did he know?
Yes.
Well, Abraham
Abraham. We'll take a look at that. Look at the tense of this. Did he say, for some will unwittingly entertain angels? What's the tense? Pointing back to the past. And what kind of examples has he been using, for example, in chapter 11? Old Testament examples, the faithful of the Old Testament. And I think the two examples, and there's some others like that, that have just been stated, are exactly what he's talking about. Abraham, in chapter 18 of Genesis, is sitting according to the Bible, at the door of his tent in the heat of the day, which would be about midday, about lunchtime, about noontime. And he's sitting there, and three men approach. And at first, he doesn't know the identity. They start talking about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the first dispatches the other two. We believe turn up in the next chapter, the angels that turn up there. And so Abraham's sitting there, and he begins a conversation, and he, midway through realizes this is God he's talking to. Now, in the very next chapter, Lot's sitting in the gate of Sodom, which means he is like a magistrate, something like that, a person of influence, and the angels come in, and he takes them in, and whether he knew at first they were that, probably not, because they looked like men, until after the events, but they turn out to be the messengers of God. And he's saying this in sort of a colloquial sense, almost like euphemism, to say, don't forget to be hospitable, because look what's happened in the past when people did the same thing, which would mean practice hospitality, because you never know what kind of blessings come from that. That's what he means in this passage. It's an expression, like an idiom, that intends to impress upon the readers and upon us that we practice hospitality, and that there are always unexpected blessings that come from that. And in principle, because that's what he's presenting, is that true? Is there more than one person that gets a benefit from acting that way? So let's say that you're hospitable to somebody, you're generous to somebody. Do you always feel good after doing that? Do you get motivated and encouraged after doing that? And you never know what can happen. There's all kinds of unexpected blessings that could happen. So the idea is be hospitable, because you never know what hospitality will bring. And I think some of the examples, Genesis 18, Genesis 19, the same thing happened with Gideon in Judges chapter 6, and then later in the same book with Manoah and Mrs. Manoah in Judges chapter 13. Those were Samson's parents, and the same thing happened to them. They had a visit, and they had unexpected blessings to come from that. Does that make sense? I think that's what he's talking about here, especially given that he's referring back to the past. But I don't think he's saying that you'll right now in 2023 have angels sitting in your home, and you won't even know that they're angels, but you just practice hospitality, because he's pointing back to historical events when he does that. So that's all the more reason to practice hospitality. All right, verse 3. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Okay, this is one of those rich Bible words that you kind of have to have the background of it for it to make a lot of sense here, because typically when we say remember something, what are we implying? We're saying either you've forgotten about it or don't forget about it. And is that the way the word remember is used here in the Bible? No. In the Bible, the word remember often means to act on, right? So a great example of this would be, there's several. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. A great example would be Noah. Okay, so you've got Genesis 6, 14, or start with verse 8. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 14, you get the conditions of the ark. And so all this thing is going on, the building of the ark. And then the Bible will say in chapter 7, and God remembered Noah. And that doesn't mean he had forgotten Noah. It means he acted on the promises of saving Noah and his family. So that's the kind of language there. Or maybe it's chapter 8, verse 1, but it's one of those two. So he's talking about taking action on these people, right? Remembering in the sense of doing something about whatever is under consideration. Now, when he says, remember the prisoners as if chained with them, this is something apparently that the readers had already been involved in. Because go back a couple of chapters, chapter 10, go back to chapter 10. And look at verse 34. When we were in chapter 10, we observed this. Look at verse 34. Speaking to the readers, he said, "For you had compassion on me in my chains." Does that sound like what he's talking about over in chapter 13? All right, so you got prisons, and now you've got chains in chapter 10, verse 34. "And you joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven." So they were already familiar with the practice of doing that. But obviously in verse 3 now, this is an inspired admission that some of them were being persecuted to the point of actually being put in prison. Some of them had reached that at least. Not all of them, but some were in and some were out. And this was a regular practice in the first century. Saints in the first century were regularly subjected to imprisonment for their faith, for what they believed. And Paul is perhaps no greater example than Paul, because he was in and out of prison the whole time he was a Christian. Gene?
Prisons back then, as they are today in the Middle East, do not provide you with
No,
food.
that's right.
If your family or someone doesn't provide you with food and clothing, you die.
Yeah. And so that's one of our talking points. And since Gene mentioned that, let's talk about some of the conditions of a first century prison. The first of which is, if you're going to have provision inside the jail, you've got to have somebody to provide that for you, a friend, a family member. Otherwise, you don't get it. Philip?
That's what it's talking about in Matthew, the 25th chapter. Those in prison, they need their need there for
Yeah.
everything. Because they were in prison because of their faith.
Yeah,
Not of wrongdoing, but by their faith.
yeah. So imagine in the first century, like Gene was talking about, these prisons, we get a little sense in the New Testament what they were like. Did they have concreted walls and nice tiled floors and fluorescent lighting? And there was a section for showering and the restrooms in the back. What were they like? It was like a dungeon. There was no light, and they were almost completely dark on the inside. They were infested with rodents. There was human waste everywhere all over the floor of the prison, and so you were subject to disease and all kinds of sicknesses in there, and it was terrible. So if you needed anything, it had to be provided from the outside, and that's what he's talking about in verse 3, about those on the outside doing something for those on the inside. And by the way, this is just something to consider. There's the long debate about Paul. He would often mention how large a letters he's written and the thorn in the flesh. And a lot of people think that was actually he had eyesight issues that could stem back from, the scales that fell off of his eyes in chapter 9. But remember, he was in prison a lot, in dark places, often where there was no light coming through. So if that was the case, that could have been a contributing factor to that we don't know. But there's no light, infested with rats, covered in human waste, no supplies except those provided by friends and family. And now he's telling, if you're on the outside, do something, especially as a Christian, for your brothers and sisters on the inside. In fact, listen to how he states it. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them. What's he saying? Put yourself in their shoes. If you were rotting away in a prison, what would you want your brothers and sisters, your family in Christ, to do for you? This is a lot like the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do unto you. So the way we treat others should always be from the perspective of standing in their shoes. Now he adds in the New King James, it's sort of set off parenthetically. In some, I think the New American Standard set it off almost as a separate category of people, and they say, and also those who are mistreated. New King James has it as those who are mistreated. It almost sounds like a commentary on what's going on in jail to remind us of the conditions in the first century. Art.
Obviously, a lot of these people were in prison because of what they believed.
Yes, absolutely.
Who's to say for what in the years to come, you find yourself in jail?
Entirely possible.
How are we going to treat you?
It's entirely possible.
I'd say support mechanism
Yeah.
that continues with Christians.
Yeah, entirely possible.
I'm saying go in there and support criminals because they're criminal. Even there, though, a lot of criminals have hit the rock bottom. Sometimes that's their turning point.
And as a Christian, right? So I know that a jail it's a jail, And physical conditions are probably better in modern jails to some respect, right? Can you imagine as a Christian going to jail simply because you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or that you just want to practice Christianity the way it's written in the Bible? Can you imagine being taken away from your family and even being put in a modern jail? Can you imagine the horror of that? Because the moral environment, the moral culture of a prison system is horrible. You'd be fighting for your life on the inside. And can you imagine? And imagine the brightness that would come to your day if Christians came to visit you or were able to get you some supply. I mean, it would make all the difference in the world. And I think if we're putting ourselves in the shoes of the people who could potentially be in that, we can see why that would be important. And then, of course, at the end he says, since you yourselves are also in the body. Now, there's a lot. This is one of those also debated passages. How do you take this? What's a way that it could be taken? What is it? Okay, so one way, and I think there's some merit to this, which is you consider this because you're in the church also. They're in the church and you're in the church, and as a brother or sister in Christ, you have an obligation to help the needs of the people who are there, especially if they're there for persecution. So it's entirely possible that the body here would be the body of Christ. I think that's one way it could be taken. What's the other way it could be taken? I think there's basically two. Yeah, Joel?
You're also in a
Physical body.
You know what it is like to be hungry or to be unclothed.
That's right. And how did he tell them to consider those folks? What? As if you're sitting there, which would be, hey, I understand what it would be like to be without food and in total darkness and without a coat and without any kind of sustenance. And I understand that I have a body too, and I can understand that. So I'm not exactly sure. In the context, maybe it seems more physical, but I can see it both ways. But the idea is that I'm just as subject to ill treatment. I could end up in prison anytime. You know, that somebody was saying that there's a potentiality for that in the future, like Art was just saying. But that could be me. I could be sitting in jail, and I know how much I would want to see the faces of the people that I love. I think that would make a difference. Tom?
I think it could be broadly put in the characteristic of a political person.
Yes. Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. It's like,
Yeah.
could very well happen in this country.
Yeah. I think that's the case. And that happened a lot in the first century, and conditions were never super great for any of them. All right, let's move to verse 4. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. All right, so marriage is honorable among all. Now, real quick on that among all, there is a debate because in some manuscripts that's presented as neuter, some as masculine, and if it was neuter, it would sound something like this. Marriage is honorable in all respects. Right? If it's masculine, it would be referring to the people. It would be marriage is honorable among all people. And specifically here, the idea would be, especially the church, better consider marriage to be an honorable thing. But the point is, marriage is honorable. It's honorable because only God ordained it. He gets to set the standards for it, and however He legislated marriage to be, it's supposed to be held in the highest regard. So, how would we define biblical marriage? What are some points? You go to Genesis 2, you look at Matthew 19. What are some things that would help us define biblical marriage? Yeah, Gloria?
One man, one woman.
Okay. So it's a monogamous relationship, and along that same line, man and woman, it's a heterosexual relationship, right? A man and a woman, but it's one man and one woman. And those two things primarily would be under consideration here, although there's a lot of other things that we could add to it. But that's it. And even still, two people that get involved in that have to be qualified to get into that position. Right? So there's basically three categories of people in the Bible who are qualified to be married. Can you think of them? What would one be? All right, people who have never been married can marry. Right? If you're a man, you can marry a woman who's never been married, and those two can come together, and they can be brought together as one flesh. So never married. What's another category? All right, so somebody who's widowed, right? Your spouse dies, and then you can marry another. 1 Corinthians 7:39, do it in keeping with the Lord's will. And then there's another category. scripturally divorced, right? They've put away a mate because of that person's fornication, and then, of course, according to Matthew 19:9, Matthew 5:32, other passages, they can be remarried scripturally. That is, the person who put the other away, they can be remarried scripturally. And if it is a scripturally qualified person, and it is fitting with the requirements for marriage, when two people enter into that kind of relationship, that is to be a respected relationship. And the principle of it is to be respected. And not only is the coming together of those two to be respected, there's also another component of it that's supposed to be held in high regard. What's that? The bed. What's that a euphemism for? Sexuality. The intimacy within the relationship. Sexuality is not a dirty, nasty thing. It's a good thing because who created it? God created it. Our culture has told us that sex is dirty and foul. It is not. It was created by God to be a good thing. But the sexual relationship, the bed, falls under what? Marriage. It's the only place it's limited to be. And the marriage and the sexuality that goes along with the marriage, if it's scriptural and it's right, it is an honorable thing. But he flips it right around, and what's he say?
It looks like there's a line drawn right.
There is a line. There's something on the other side that isn't honorable at all. What's on the other side? Fornicators and adulterers. And he says, God will judge. What does judge mean in this passage here? Condemnation. Which means, and I know, listen, stealing is bad, and murder is terrible, right? And all this, we list a lot of things that people will be lost for. Will people be lost for mistreating marriage and the bed? Yes. It's a serious issue, okay? So there's two categories here. One is fornicators. Now, this is the broadest of the terms. Fornication is a really broad term. These are people who engage in illicit sexual activity. This would be premarital sex, extramarital sex, rape, bestiality, homosexuality, pedophilia, anything like that. And that's the category. These people are disrespecting marriage and the bed. Then there's adulterers, which is a very specific word because adultery refers to what? It's fornication where at least one person is a married party, and that becomes adultery. And the point he's making is here, because generally, when, for example, if two people are committing adultery, is that something they usually do openly? They try to hide it, right? You go rent a hotel room in another state because you think nobody will find out. And what's his point here? Do you really ever get away with that? Because God's going to judge that. He just reminded them in the previous chapter that God is the judge of everything. Nothing escapes God's eye, not even sexual activity that is concealed from the eyes of other people. Now, I want to pause here real quick and get your thoughts on this. This verse alone, I feel like, does not define our society anymore. What in the world has happened with marriage and the home in our culture? What's going on with that? Why have we come so far away from marriage as honorable and all? Because it almost seems like the message we're getting in every possible form is marriage is not a good thing, do whatever you want. And what's going on? Bobby and then Phil? Bobby?
The desire to take God out of civilization.
Yeah.
Take God out and break down the family.
Yeah.
Break down the family where it's no longer needed.
Yeah, there's certainly an agenda there because in truth, the church is only ever as strong as families are strong because they make up the church. And when you break down the families, it affects the church. And so that's certainly true. There's an agenda there, Philip.
Well, I'm saying the same thing here.
Yeah.
We leave God out of it.
Yeah. You take God out, and that's the thing.
Nothing left.
Yeah, Art?
You often hear, I want, in a lot of things, not just marriage, but we hear it in the church too. I want to, people want instant gratification and they want it their way.
Yeah.
And when they're not willing to compromise and work it out in a marriage, a lot of people.
Yeah, it would be real easy to chase a rabbit here, but it's just, I don't know that it's hard to imagine that we've come to the place where we are in culture where let's just take the issue of homosexuality, for example, because that is a distortion of marriage and the bed, right? That falls on the other side. Like Joel was saying, there's a line right there, and it's clearly on the other side of that. It is so aggressive in our culture today. Homosexuality has always been around, but in our culture, there was a time when if people practiced homosexuality, it was private. They sometimes concealed it. And now the effort is in our culture to not just practice it, but force you to openly endorse that lifestyle. So maybe it's all that, what Bobby and Phil were talking about. It's just how have we come so far away from not considering marriage an honorable thing? It's scary that we've come to that point, Terry. Yeah, and let's add to that, since he's talking about the failure to stand up and speak. How would you rate the church's response on this issue of marriage is honorable, all on the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge? How would you rate our response overall to that? It's not been very good, and I can illustrate it this way. I just think it's not an indictment of, for example, North Hammond. I just say it's the church in general. I think the issue is we are willing on a lot of issues to speak out on a lot of issues, and we'll talk about a lot of things. You know, we don't. Do you think when it comes to the time to do it, if you have, for example, a congregation with conviction, we can get up and say abortion is murder and it's wrong? We're willing to do that, right? And we're willing to stand up and say, hey, homosexuality is not a good thing, while you still have people in the congregation committing fornication and committing adultery, right? And we don't deal with that. It's like somehow that's not a big issue when the Bible says fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And if we're not willing to start in our own house and say, this is serious enough that we want to try to help people out of that, then what effect are we going to have on the world? And I don't know that the church's response in general over the last several decades has been really good on that issue. Right? So it's not an indictment of North Hamilton as much as it is just to say the church in general has been really terrible at helping people who are struggling with sexual sin or distortions of marriage fix that stuff. I don't know. Obviously, the answer is right here. What do we have to come back to? How do we get to where we need to be? You got to think marriage is honorable, and you got to really believe it to the point that you do something about it. Carol?
Personal standpoint, I believe that in the last few years that what has escalated this homosexual, what is the laws that our state and federal government has changed.
Yeah. And what happens with this, I'm gonna go upstream from where you are. It's coming, right? I already know some congregations who are already delving into this. But if you're unwilling to hold that marriage is honorable and all, and the bed is undefiled, and whoremongers and adulterers God is going to judge, then what do you think happens eventually within congregations? It's not just adultery anymore. What happens? It's homosexuality. And all of a sudden we're saying, well, let's don't really say anything about it, and God loves them too, which He does, but we become unwilling to say, listen, God has a standard for marriage, and here's what it is, and sexuality is limited to within that heterosexual monogamous relationship for qualified people, and outside of that, there's going to be condemnation, and we get outside of that, and in some congregations, I'm already reading their articles, and I'm already seeing what they're doing publicly, and they're saying that you can never condemn homosexuality, and that's what happens when we give up on the sanctity of marriage. That's the direction. Carl, did you have you just put your hand up? Okay, yeah, that's great. Hey, Jimmy.
Well, to that extent, 2 Timothy 4, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine
Yeah.
according to their own desires.
Yeah.
Because their itching ears will heat up themselves teachers, will turn their ears away from the truth. And that's exactly what I see.
Yeah.
It's love of self. And that's what you're trying to promote is love yourself and not even acknowledge God.
Yeah, that's it, love for self. Marriage is so important. It was the first institution God put on the earth. It's the first one He put on the earth. It's super important. And if we can return to that, not only will we have strong congregations, there's influence that sheds outward because people are looking for that. They're looking for stability and constancy, and they want that, and they see that. They got to see it in the church. And it's easy, right? Do you think the world can look at a congregation and say, y'all are a bunch of hypocrites? Y'all take a stand against everything else except fornication and adultery. Do you think they see that? They can see it. So we have to be consistent in that. Don?
Well, I think part of the issue sounds like Matthew 7:14, 7:13 and 14, when it talks about
Straight and narrow. Yeah.
when we as Christians take stands, rightfully so, we have to, we want to, wrongful marriage is sinful.
Yeah.
If you're married and somebody committed adultery,
Right.
you don't have to strictly divorce. People in the world, when you talk to them about stuff like that, they instantly want to put you on the defensive saying, oh, you're too narrow-minded.
Mm.
No, we're not. We're going with what the Bible,
Yeah.
God's Word says.
Yeah.
We have to continue to do that, and if people outside of Christianity want to believe that that's too narrow and that we're being too narrow, so be it. I mean, we can't change, we don't
Yeah.
want to change.
All we're trying to tell people is, I didn't write the Bible. God did. And we've got to follow what He says because that's the path that leads to heaven. And there are people who are going to reject that, and some, that will take it. But that's it. I mean, that's the path. He's laid it for us. According to 1 John 5 and verse 3, this is the love of God that you keep His commandments. His commandments aren't grievous. It's a joyful thing to do what God said. We just have to learn how to do it, but you're exactly right. All right, verses 5 and 6 real quick next week before we jump into, or the week after before we jump into verse 7. And I love verses 5 and 6. It's challenging because He said, don't love stuff. Be content. But there's a promise that comes along with that. As long as you trust me, I'll never leave you or forsake you. And we'll see what He says in verse 6. All right, guys, put a peg in it there. Thank you for your input today.